I will tell her.
Okay.
Oh, for those, Francine's my sister.
Oh,
Sure.
sorry. Francine and I went to school together. A million years ago, right, Michael?
Well, no, only 3 years ago.
Oh.
Yeah. No, we're only in our early 20s. You know that.
Oh,
Yeah.
dream on, Michael, dream on.
Is Judy Stern my mother-in-law?
Yes. Is she on?
Well, there's a Judy. I don't. That's actually a common name among Jews. That's a nice hi. This Judy. Hi, Judy. Good to see you.
Good to be here. Hi,
Hi, Judy.
how you doing?
I'm good. Are you good?
Yeah,
Good. Good.
So then this class and the next couple, I'm going to look at just some very basic things that we go in the synagogue, try to orient ourselves as to what we're doing, because it's not always, we don't always make clear what's going on. I think that we have the experience that we're sitting in services, and at certain parts of the service, you notice that people are looking around, they're a little nervous, saying how many people are here. If there's a certain number of people here, we're going to go forward. If there's not enough people, we're going to do something else. But we don't always explain what we're doing, and we don't always the roadmap is sometimes a little complicated. So I just want to really start at the very beginning, talk about what the requirements for public worship are. Try to explain as best as I can why I think that's the case. There's only one text, two texts that we'll look at. And the goal is simply so that we have our, basically so we can navigate the service better.
Why did you do
There's
that? Why did
not
you
really
do
a-
that? What's with you?
So
What's with you?
Rabbi, would you ask people to
I
mute?
don't
please?
even know how to get back on. Christ.
this is the magic of Zoom.
Stan, you are on.
I'm on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought I got lost here.
So we're all here. We're all ready to go. And with that, I'll jump into the presentation. This is I just keep talking, but if you have a question, you want to stop me, tackle me, and if I need to explain something in more depth, let me know. The agenda for tonight: why do Jews need a minyan? Basically just talk about what is a minyan, which segments of the service require a minyan, why is a minyan ever required, why don't we feel that we can just do without this, why the number 10. As we're going to see, that the number we keep coming back to is the number 10. Why is it that number? Why isn't it like 7 or 13 or a different number? Who counts in a minyan? And different communities have different standards about that. And I will do my best to explain those positions. And the final category is potpourri. So, and we will get to that when we get to this. So what is a minyan? Minyan's a Hebrew word. It just means counting. And it refers to the requirement of a quorum for certain prayers. In traditional settings, the standard is 10 adult men. Egalitarian congregations count both men and women, and we'll speak a little bit about the disagreement, the textual issues and the controversies that arise from that. So that the segments of the service that require a minyan include any Kaddish, anytime we're saying Yit Gadol V'Yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah, whether it's the short Kaddish we say between prayers, whether it's the Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish, or whether it's the mourner's Kaddish, any Kaddish is considered to require a minyan. The Baruch Hu, what we say when we introduce the service, Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. If it's Friday night, we sing it that way, but we sing it different ways on other nights. But the Baruch Hu is something that's always done in a minyan. A segment of prayer called the Kedusha, which is when, during the repetition, when we say responsively, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Sevot. When we do that in the context of the repetition of the Amida, that's considered to require minyan, though interestingly, we say it without a minyan on a regular basis as the part of the worship service. And the blessings for the Torah and the Haftorah reading require a minyan. We usually express this last one as we say that the public reading of the Torah or the Haftorah require a minyan, but that isn't precisely correct. There's no bar against if there's 3 of us in the sanctuary to say, well, we'll take the Sefer Torah out and we'll read the weekly portion. You can read it. You just can't say the blessings that you can't have the aliyahs basically, or what requires a minyan. So these are the parts of the service that you'll, so usually it's often the case that for the first part of the service, we don't have a minyan, but we can begin anyway with the initial prayers. But when we get to the Baruch Hu, we start to look around and we start to see if there's a minyan. And if there's not one there, hopefully there'll be one in time for the repetition and the Torah reading. Failing that, we hope that there's a minyan by the mourner's Kaddish at the end, because many people do come to the synagogue with the expectation that they will be able to say Kaddish, and it's very disappointing. It's always disappointing to not have a minyan, but I think it's especially disappointing to not have a minyan when we have people who have the need to remember a loved one, or if they're in mourning themselves, that we can't accommodate them. So these are the parts of the service where we require a quorum or a minyan before we can move ahead, before we can do those parts of the service. There's a term that we use in Hebrew to describe this, Kedusha, kol davar shebekdusha. Any section that inquires Kedusha, which means holiness, is something that is considered to require the minyan. And we can see how this plays into the categories that we have. Kaddish is simply Aramaic for Kiddush or holiness. It's the same word, so I think it's clear how that applies. For the Baruch Hu, it's very closely related to the Kaddish. In many ways, the Baruch Hu is a Hebrew translation of a certain part of the Kaddish, so it's understandable that that would require a minyan. Kiddusha, Kadosh, 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 again, it's right in the word Kedusha. It requires a minyan, and the blessings for the Torah and the Haftorah are closely related to the Baruch Hu. And so this is all of these things that the unifying category that our sages ascribe to the things that need a minyan is this idea of matters of holiness. Kol davar shebekdusha. We stop and we require a quorum. And just theoretically, I think it's worth to think a little bit about why a minyan would be required. What does it do? How does it elevate? How does it give definition to what we do as Jews in the sanctuary? I mean, the first thing on the list is that, I mean, many of us, well, the oral law, the Talmud says so. And that's if you identify with Rabbinic Judaism, if you identify with traditional Judaism, that's going to be a powerful reason. But even moving beyond this, the idea that it just says so, we're following the rule book. There are things that are descriptive, that are definitional about Judaism, that make public prayer, that make the attendance of people in person to worship extremely essential. And I think these things are not things that necessarily separate Judaism from other religions, but some of them are. And the first one I have is Judaism's commitment to the concept of public revelation, that in the way that we describe God's presence to the Jewish people historically or mythologically or our narrative is that God does not appear to us in an individual revelation in the way that the connection between Jesus of Nazareth and God in heaven is a private and personal connection, or that the revelation to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, that was also something that did not occur in public. That was a private revelation that Muhammad had. Our view of revelation is something that occurs in public because we're a nation, we're a people, and that the religious life of Jews, therefore, revolves around the need to express it to each other in the public forum. Simply as the beginning, we were created in public revelation, and so therefore we continue the practice of public worship. And so when we decide that we need to have public participation, the question is, what does that mean? And the sages go on to define that. Also of importance to note is the political nature of both the written and the oral Torahs, that the rabbis and the scripture sees itself as a political document that's come to order society. The Torah is really the constitution of Israel in the time of the Second Temple. And the rabbis continued to understand it as a political constitution, even in the era where it was basically defunct because we had lost our independence. And because the matters of the Torah are primarily concerned with how we order ourselves as a society, it becomes essential that we when we gather together to reflect this back to God, that we are organized publicly in person as a people as well. There's the question of the transmission of a public liturgical tradition, that unlike Christianity, where a priest can be appointed to know the scripture and to be able to pray on behalf of everyone, every Jew is expected to be able to pray for his or herself. But not just whatever they want to do, but in terms of liturgy, in terms of something that the community agrees upon. And in order to develop that, and in order to transmit that the definition of what our worship is what the public agrees that it should be. And the only possible way that that can be transmitted in an era before television, before media, before people had books, is for people to be together on a regular basis in order to be exposed to the liturgical tradition that ours. And finally, you have the fact that the nature of Jewish learning is conversational, that the best learning that we do is not frontal learning where somebody says, like me, I'm going to talk to you for 50 minutes and you're going to listen. But the best learning that we do is that when we learn together, when we talk to each other. And just as revelation itself was a public event for Judaism, the ongoing exposition, development, and the refinement of that tradition requires us to come together. And the tradition of the study hall, the Jewish house of worship is not just a place of prayer, it's a place of learning. And it's a place where we want to continue the public spirit of learning as it began for us in our prehistory or in our mythological past. So the reason that we need it is even if there wasn't this rule, even if we didn't have the statement in the oral Torah saying you got to do this, even if we didn't have that rule, there are things about Judaism that would require and demand that we cultivate a sense that there's a threshold that Jewish worship requires a community that's together. And then the question is, what's the threshold? Do you say when you have that community? Do you say you have a threshold when you have 3? Well, there are some things that 3 works for, or do you say 7 or 10 or whatever? Why 10? Why 10? And I'm going to give you the probable answer. I think the actual answer. I'm going to follow that up with the happy answer. But then we're going to go back to the less happy but critical rabbinical answer, which is going to allow us to set the table for for future things. But but before I go on, I'm interested in what you guys have to think. What's kind of the obvious answer for why we actually settle on the number 10?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay, that's the happy answer. That's the edified answer. That's the edified answer. But
Would you explain that, please, Rabbi?
Oh, well, Joshua said why the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the middle one. But then that's a popular one. But that wasn't even without a text. What's kind of the likely reason we do 10?
Well, it's because of the Meraglim, that it's a tradition, because the Meraglim were sent to see Israel before they entered. So they were 10.
So you guys are too smart. That's the third that's the less happy but rabbinically correct answer. That's the third one I'm going to do. You guys, but even the most simple thing. The most simple
10
thing.
fingers, and 10 is considered a complete number.
Yeah, I mean, you're counting. I mean, you look at our hands. I mean, if you're, it's the most basic number that we have. And we have it all over in Judaism. We have this tradition that there are 10 utterances of creation, 10 times that God says, let there be something in the first chapter of the book of Genesis. We have the tradition of the 10 plagues, and we have the tradition of the 10 commandments. And besides all of those, and those things obviously have in common the number 10. But what's another thing that all of those things have in common? This is a little trickier. But the other thing that they have in common is there's not really 10 of those things. If you send somebody to go count the plagues in the Bible, unless they know they're going to get 10, they're not going to get 10. They're going to get 12 or 13. Or likewise, if you give somebody the 22nd chapter of the 21st chapter of Exodus, it's the 22nd chapter of Exodus, where the 10 commandments appear, and say, count the commandments. They're not going to come back with 10. There's more of them. That in all of these instances, we've imposed a 10 upon things that are really much more complicated than 10, because 10 is simply an elemental Jewish number. It's an elemental human number. We have 10 fingers, or 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. And Billy,
we need people to bear witness. If you have just one person praying, how do we know that that person is praying? So in order to make the event of praying holy, you need an audience. You need people to pray with you. Yeah.
It really makes a difference. It really makes a difference of how it's perceived. I mean, both in how we act, because I mean, does anyone else here pray differently in public than they do in private? I mean, I
don't stand up. I don't stand up all the time.
The prayers that I do when I'm in public are a lot better than the prayers that I do when I'm in private, because people are watching me, because there's accountability, right. and because I know that I'm there to set an example, as Billy said, that we want people to bear witness to what we're doing, and we need people in there to do this, and that's why it's such a powerful thing. So the first answer, and I think this is the real answer. I think that this is why we settled on 10. It's just an elemental number that works for us in several contexts. And if we have something that works here, we use it for other things. Which takes us to the happy, edifying, inspiring story of 10. Which I think Joshua did allude to. And I think that if you just ask people, well, what's the textual basis for this? 9 out of 10 Jews are going to say exactly what Joshua said. It's a story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God is threatening to destroy Sodom. And what's the offer that God makes to Abraham makes to God? Let me find 10 righteous people. And if I can find 10, then please save the entire community. And so since 10 was the number that Abraham chose in order to make the offer with God, there's something elemental about that. That if we can get 10 righteous Jews together, and wouldn't it be great if we could get 10 righteous Jews together instead of our usual association of scoundrels? But if we could do that, I mean, that would have the authority to say something wonderful about the community. And so this is really an edifying way of looking at it, that we are making a statement with the matter of Minyan, that a small group of people, 10 is not a large number of people, can speak for the community and perhaps save the world. That the efforts and the prayers of a small number of Jews can have a tremendous effect. Now, I actually believe that that's true, and I think that that's a very nice story. But the difficulty with using this as an answer is simply that this is never a text that the rabbis use to describe why we have Minyan. And it takes us in a direction that, as you'll see, that is a little bit different than the text, than the tradition that the rabbis do fall upon to do, which I'll turn to in just a moment. But before I do that, I'll just I want to. We've done a bit of material here. I want to make sure that people have a chance to give comments that they want to make at this point, and ask any questions of anything that we've looked at so far that might not be clear or might need to be expanded or clarified.
Mhm.
You know, I might be really off base here, but the number 10 is really interesting in that the 1 could be seen as being and the 0 as non-being. You know, I might be thinking too much about computers here too, but it is a very interesting number in that it seems to be a number that includes opposites.
It's I think numerology is a very natural thing. And like in antiquity, you wouldn't have that sense of what 10 meant, because they didn't have the sense of 1 and zeros that we have, or computers. But it's fascinating that how our minds naturally project meaning onto numbers. And it's numbers in antiquity are very important, obviously, but I think we miss the boat if we don't recognize that they're important and inspiring to us. So I don't think you're off base at all.
Uh-huh.
I was going to say that 10 might be the maximum number of things that most people can remember, but in fact, our telephone numbers have 7 digits, because psychologists, when they were trying to set up the phone company, found that the most number of things that most people can remember is 7. So,
is that what they call Eddington's number?
Is what?
Is that what they call Eddington's number? Joshua.
I don't know.
Josh Zielinski, is that Eddington's number, 7?
I think Eddington's number is 137, but that's that's the one coming from the fine structure constant is what you're thinking of, yes?
No, I thought Eddington's number was the number, I thought it was from cognitive science. I screwed up.
You're thinking of, so there are a whole bunch of different numbers. So I think you're thinking of, so there are a whole bunch of different things going on here. So in the cog sci context, in fact, Eve just made this comment, but it was muted. We were still muted. Humans remember things better if they chunk stuff. So that's why 7 is actually used. It's because a chunk of 3 or 4 is easier to remember. So 7 is big enough that if you chunk one group of 3 and one group of 4, you're fine with the number. If you try to memorize all 7 digits of lots of numbers without chunking, you'll have a much more difficult time. So numbers actually were originally created that way for telephone numbers, precisely to make it easier to chunk. So people who didn't know that that was the easiest thing to do would do so.
Well, also people, didn't they have like, it was like Klondike 5 or something?
Wait, what's that? I'm not
No,
sure.
some phone numbers didn't even have numbered. You dial like Klondike 5.
Yeah, but that's
432.
earlier
Yeah,
before they transition.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I don't know what specific thing you're thinking of though, in terms of Eddington's number. I'm not familiar with. I thought you were referencing a certain other story involving Sir Arthur Eddington. That's a different number, has nothing to do with this.
I'm just, it's my own cognitive decline, but I appreciate your answers. And I just think it's fascinating how numbers are really, I feel like we're opening up our minds when we talk about what can be remembered and what numbers mean to us. Any other questions before I give the tedious but important rabbinic answer of why we have 10?
I have a question about, you said that one of your reasons for the 10 at the beginning was that in Judaism, revelation is a public matter. But thinking about the patriarchs and in the prophets, what I remember is that they all had private revelations.
And not only that, the rabbis imagined that the greatest, and Maimonides believed that the greatest revelation of all was to a single human being, which was to Abraham, who was able to discern this on his own. But the issue is, do we regard Abraham as Jewish? And there's a strong preference in the rabbinic tradition, not to the prophetic experience or to the exploration of Abraham, but there's a strong preference to the public revelation at Sinai, because they simply felt that that's the only revelation on which the community could be built. There are in Judaism, there are in the Bible, there are in our philosophy, the idea that people do have an individual connection to God. And we just got done reading the book of Ruth in synagogue for Shavuot, which is about a person who experiences revelation not at Sinai, not in public, not with the masses, but somebody who, because of her own initiative, because of her own vision, becomes attached to Judaism. And I think that's a form of individual revelation. So there certainly is plenty of that to find in the Bible and in the tradition. But for the rabbis, the revelation at Sinai was fundamental in a way that those are not fundamental, because it's the revelation at Sinai that builds the community. I know that puts me in a circle, because on the one hand, I'm saying that, well, we do this because of the story at Sinai and its convention to and its love of public revelation. And on the other hand, well, we have the love of public revelation because of this. But so it is kind of a tautology, but it's a tautology that the rabbis organized themselves within.
So as I understand, the number 10 here for the Minyan was something that the rabbis actually agreed to use. Like the number 10 was like kind of completeness. Like you can pray by yourself, or you pray with like at least 10 people. And like there is the belief that if you pray in a tzibur with the 10 people, that is like complete, your tefillah will be more accepted. So I think it's like a belief that the 10 people are a group that makes it like complete, and it's adequate for Kedusha, for holiness.
And that's I agree with that, but more importantly, Maimonides really says that explicitly in his laws of prayer, that individual prayer and public prayer are different in exactly that sense, that when I pray individually, it's only my merit that will determine whether my prayer is heard. And relying on my merit, that could be a dicey thing depending on where I am at that time. But when I pray with the community, I'm not relying on my merit. I'm relying on the status of the community. that the getting, when we get together and we pray as a group, it's possibility for it's possibility for God to hear the prayers of sinners, because they're going to go through the channel that's kind of reserved for the communal prayer, for the prayer as a people. And whereas if I were to say the same prayers by myself, I would be left to the vicissitudes of how meritorious I am and how worthy my prayer is. And, if I was a tzaddik, I guess I'd be okay with that, but I'm not a tzaddik. And I don't think most of us are tzaddikim. And it's nice of us to have the fact that we can rely on each other, and we can rely on the belief that we speak not to God just as individuals, but we speak to God as members of his people, as a nation, that perhaps gives us a hearing that we otherwise would not have. Again, I think that I pray constantly for the health and the well-being of the people around me. I say, please God, take care of my kids. Please God, help such and such who's sick. I do that as an individual, but it's much more comforting and meaningful for me to say the Mishnah Berach at the Torah in front of the community, and to have the sense that it is the intention and it's the will of the entire community that is speaking, and it's not just something that relies on whatever goodness I have for those prayers to be heard. So psychologically, I as well as halakhically, I find that a very comforting prospect. And so we've got to do the less inspiring but rabbinically accurate story of the 10, and this is where we lose most of our viewers. So I'll do the best that I can with this. There is this is the mathematics section of the class, because the rabbis are always going to try to understand textually, even if the true meaning of this does not flow from a text. We read in the portion of Leviticus shortly before we read this section of the holidays. So we read this just a few weeks ago at Pesach. V'lo techalalu et shem kodshi v'nikdashti b'tok b'nei Yisrael ani Adonai mekadeshchem. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people, among the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctify you. So we have this saying in the Bible that says that I, and God is speaking here, may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. And this seems to be referring precisely to what we want to understand here, that how does the collection of the children of Israel, how does praising God from our midst, rather than praising God in our individualness, how does that sanctify the name of God? And the thing to understand here is that when the rabbis are talking about Kiddush Hashem, they're talking something that's very technical and something that's actually very depressing. That when we say the word Kiddush Hashem, Kiddush, the same word holiness, Kedusha. Kiddush Hashem is, for the rabbis, talking about the requirement to martyr oneself, the requirement that Jews have that we share as Jews to lay down our lives rather than to commit certain sins. Judaism has a very difficult relationship with martyrdom. On the one hand, we look at the founder of the rabbinic movement, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. He saved Judaism by refusing to be martyred. The hotheads in Jerusalem were willing to die for God. It was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's chidush. It was his inspiration. Well, maybe we won't die for God. Maybe we'll live, and by keeping our lives, we'll be able to sanctify God's name. At the same time, we have the example of the 10 martyrs. That is sort of the focal point of the worship on Yom Kippur. In the Musaf Amida, we recite the stories of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Meir, our greatest sages. All of them turned over their lives to the Romans in the cause of the sanctification for God's name. So we have antecedents in Judaism that both diminish the popularity or the drive for martyrdom, and we have examples in Judaism that highlight this drive for martyrdom. In the rabbis' legal writings, they rule that for 3 grave sins, for the sin of murder, for sexual sins, and for avodah zarah, idolatry, Jews are required to accept martyrdom rather than to transgress. That's to say that if somebody says, Bill, I want you to kill such and such, or I'm going to kill you, I'm not allowed to kill such and such to save my life. I'm required to martyr myself for the cause of to not murder people. Or if somebody says, Bill, I want you to perform this act of avodah zarah, I want you to worship this foreign god, I'm expected to lay down my life rather than worship the foreign god. But for other sins, the question is less clear. In the normal play of life, in the way that we normally live, for sins that are not these 3 grave sins, it's assumed that we're going to transgress and save our lives in order that we could sanctify God's name in other ways while we are alive. That our lives are valuable because we're able to perform mitzvot, we're able to help the world when we're alive. And so if we can, it's transactional. In the cases of light sins, we can have the possibility of, well, I'll do the transgression. If it's a law that, for some strange reason, it's a law in the United States that once a week, everybody has to eat a cheeseburger or face the death penalty. If the law is not directed at Jews in particular, we can eat the cheeseburger, even though that's a transgression, and we can avoid the death, and we can save our lives by doing that. But there's always a but. There's always a but. In a time of persecution, in a time in which the government is seeking to persecute the Jews, we are required to accept martyrdom rather than commit even light sins in public. And then this goes back to what Billy brought up so well earlier in the class, of the requirement to bear witness, that bearing witness is not just a matter of tefillah, bearing witness is a matter of our conduct. And so if it's not like a rule for everyone to eat the cheeseburger under the pain of death, if the cheeseburger rule is presented in a way to humiliate Jews or to persecute the Jews, then it's a different thing, because my conduct is either going to destroy or elevate the morale of the Jewish people. And so if I'm in public, in the case of these light sins, I do have the distressing obligation then to martyr myself. And this does seem like a distressingly low bar to me. I'd like the martyrdom bar to be a little bit higher than it actually is. But the question is, again, we have the question, if it's in public, what do we mean when we say that it's in public? How many people have to see me eat the cheeseburger for it to be a public event? And we know that the answer we're going to get to is 10. And Nechama brought up the exact logic that the rabbis use, and I'm going to walk you through that right now in this less inspiring but rabbinically accurate story of the 10. But we have the verse that we started with, V'lo tekalalu et shem kodshi v'nikdashti b'tok b'nei Israel, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. What the rabbis need to understand in this verse is the exact number that b'tok b'nei Israel represents. And we don't have clues here as to what the exact number is. But we have this is the slide where we lose the viewers. We have this rabbinic tool called the Gezerah Shava, the decree of equivalence. And this is simply a fancy word for the hermeneutic strategy of importing the context from one part of the Torah to another, where the words are identical or similar. In other words, if there's a word in the Torah that I don't understand it in the context that I'm reading it, I'm allowed to find that word someplace else in the Torah where I understand the context and bring that context back into the place that I am having trouble understanding. And we have to do this twice for this verse, and this is what the rabbis do in Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin. The first, and there's really, so the first Gezerah Shava, the first comparison they make is between the words the midst, in the midst of, in Leviticus 22, and in Numbers 16, which is the narrative of Korach, because it both has this word betoch in it, in the midst of. And so in the narrative of Korach, Moses and Aaron are told to stand back from the midst of this congregation that I may annihilate them in an instance. So we still don't have a number. We still don't have a number, but we have another phrase in this verse in number 16, ha'edah hazot, that we can take to another place in the Torah where we do have a number. And this congregation is in, as Nechama pointed out, the narrative of the spies. How much, this is God lamenting, how much longer shall this wicked congregation keep muttering against me? Very well, I have heeded the incessant muttering of the Israelites against me. And in this case, we know what the number is, because the number of spies that defamed the land in this story, the number of people in this wicked congregation that keeps muttering, we know is 10. There were 12 spies, one for each tribe. 2 of the spies were good. Joshua was good. Caleb was good. The other 10 spies were bad. So we have the number 10 for this congregation. We take that back to number 16, this congregation, from the midst of this congregation of 10. And then we import that context all the way back to Leviticus 22. And so that when we read Leviticus 22, you shall not profane my holy name that I may be sanctified in the midst, which we now know is 10 people of the Israelite people. I am the Lord who sanctify you. Now, this is the sort of thing a lot of people say, oh, I want to study Talmud. It's really groovy. It sounds very spiritual. And then when you unload something like this, they say, why did I even bother to show up? What sort of silliness have you exposed us to? And all I can say is, if you really groove to this, Talmud is your thing, and you should study more Talmud with me. If you don't really groove to this, at least we got the number. We got the number 10, and I've explained to you why the rabbis believe, one, that in our context of Sanhedrin, that 10 is what the public means. If I have to lay down my life rather than eat the cheeseburger in front of a community of 10 people. But because it's used for Kiddush Hashem in that instance, it's also used for every element that's a matter of Kedusha, a matter of holiness. And this, my friends, is the perhaps less inspiring but rabbinically accurate story of how we get to 10 through the sort of these textual gymnastics that the rabbis have for us. But this is, but besides just the knowing the arithmetic and knowing the gymnastics, we're going to see that this has implications for how we understand our Minyan today. And I will. There's the number of defaming spies was 10, and so that's what takes us home.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
If they were the wicked, if the 10 of them were wicked, why would that be the number for a holy congregation?
Because well, kind of jumping to the end, there's you have arguments about do non-religious people count for minions? Do the non-righteous count for minions? And I hope that we do. I hope that I do. And the power of saying that the number is based on this 10 scoundrels, 10 people that weren't righteous. I mean, to me, that's more relatable than the story of Abraham, where it's the 10 righteous. That I look at that. You could look at that as a bug in it, that well, why would we rely on why would we use a congregation of scoundrels as our template? But you could also look at that as a feature, that maybe that's the sort of template we need, rather than to emphasize the fact that when we are when we join the Minyan, we are becoming something that's bigger than ourselves, which isn't the case if you're a tzaddik. I mean, I suppose if you had 10 tzaddikim, if you had 10 righteous people, they would just be, if they had just all got together, it would be unbelievable. It would be better than ever. But what we're looking for psychologically, what we're looking for theologically, what I'm looking for psychologically and theologically is an instrument which is going to bind up the prayers of us scoundrels and make them presentable and connectable to a God that would probably prefer that we were that I was more careful in my conduct.
I have a question, please. That when it comes to something you're doing wrong, that 10 people have to see it for it to be public. I've read of a concept. I think it's called Marit Ayin. The appearance of something wrong, even though it's not technically wrong. Does that 10 also apply to that?
I don't know. But I don't think so. It doesn't. I mean, it may technically. So, look, the coffee at McDonald's is completely kosher. You can rely on both the coffee and the restrooms at McDonald's. I do not go through the drive-through at McDonald's because of concerns of Marit Ayin. I don't want people to think that, well, the rabbi is getting a McRib sandwich or something there. And that's a concern that I have. I mean, maybe not halakhically, but at least psychologically, I would not want a single Jew to see me in that drive-through. And whether that's technically what the rabbis called Marit Ayin, I don't know, but it's certainly conceptually and psychologically for me, that thing. So I think that Marit Ayin is something that that applies in circumstances that that don't necessarily involve 10. And for Marit Ayin, by the way, it's not a question of laying down your life. It's because the person who's doing something that we're concerned with Marit Ayin is not actually sinning. It's they're just putting themselves in a position where they could be seen to be sinning. So I think I would be stricter with Marit Ayin than the number 10. If one Jew can see me in the line at McDonald's, that's one Jew too many. Before I go on to the who counts, or if you want to come down and I know I went through the text stuff very quickly. If you want to review that with me at some point, I'd be happy to. Or any questions now? It's rather complicated, but I think it is worthwhile to know where that source comes from. Who counts for a minyan? And I have 4 categories here: Jews versus Jews or non-Jews, righteous people or Shabbat observers. I already spoke a little bit about that. Age and gender. The Talmud does ask the question, would a non-Jew count in the minyan of people that could require a Jew to be liable to martyr themselves? But the Talmud regards it as a stupid question. The Talmud just says, well, no, of course we're talking about Jews here. It doesn't really give the explanation. It just regards the question as stupid on its surface. It is a live matter today because there are communities around the country. I know of some where they do count formally non-Jews as part of the minyan. They simply have as their policy 10 human beings is what we're going to use here for the minyan. I understand sort of the logic for that. I think it's a very, it's based on sort of a Levinasian, after Emmanuel Levinas, his idea that whenever the tradition says Israel, we should see humanity, and that's a very nice thing. I don't think that would ever be my practice, but that is a live issue in some communities. The question of righteousness or Shabbat observers, you will hear halakhic authorities say that a minyan cannot contain sinful Jews, that the requirement of a minyan is that you have to have Jews that are at a minimum Shabbat observant. I don't want to go into their arguments of why they think that's the case, but Rav Moshe Feinstein, the greatest halakhic authority in America, said that's completely crazy. And it's completely crazy because you know the source from Sanhedrin, where we know that we base the whole idea of the minyan on it being a community of scoundrels. If the basis for the quorum is this community of scoundrels, how do you get off saying that everybody here has to be a tzaddik in order to count? So, but you do run into this issue in contemporary halakhic arguments. The final two things I want to talk about, because we run into them in practice in the synagogue, is age and gender. The Talmud gives a couple different answers to the question, at what age is somebody eligible to participate in public prayer? I mean, one answer that the Talmud gives is that the person is old enough to know before whom one is standing, that you're assessing the maturity, the intellectual maturity of the minor. And if the minor is at that level, you can go ahead and count them. The other definition the Talmud gives is the general definition of adulthood in the Talmud, which is puberty, which refers to the production of pubic hairs in the beautiful language of our oral Torah. Our practice, and the practice is longstanding, has never been to like ask people, well, have you undergone puberty yet? How's your body changing? What we do is we rely on the mean age, that boys tend to be mature by the age of 13, and we rely on that for their participation in the minyan. Congregations which count women, sometimes they just use 13 for women too. Others note that the understanding of the Talmud and biological reality is that women mature earlier, and that the date of maturity given in the Talmud is 12 and a half for women, and some communities rely on that. It is, for the communities that rely on 13, it does create a sort of like a strange dimorphism, a strange binary thing for the B'nai Mitzvah, because as I've tutored hundreds of B'nai Mitzvah children, the girls, you look at them and you're thinking, they could be babysitters for me. I'm going to give them these jobs. We're going to hire them and put them to work. They're so mature. The boys, you're afraid to leave them in the room by themselves at age 13. And so I think that there is kind of a case for lowering the age for the girls to make the experience more similar between the groups, because when you look at the quality of the presentation, the women tend to be much more composed and mature than the boys, and that's simply a function of the reality that maturity happens differently depending on gender or sexuality. There is one exception for age that is well known, and that's to say that a minor, somebody that's under the age of majority, can count as the 10th of a minyan. That says you can't have a minyan full of kids, but if you have 9 adults and if you have one minor amongst them, you're allowed to count the minor. The minor can be the 10th person in the minyan. That's a widespread custom and understanding. If somebody wants to ask me about counting the Torah in the minyan, we'll do that in the question and answer period. women in the Minyan, and this, going back to the source that I shared from Sanhedrin and the relation of this to martyrdom, if you use that source as the basis, there's really not a difficulty counting women in the Minyan. That there's no sense from the source that relates this back to Kiddush Hashem, to martyrdom, that there's no sense that you would count men and women differently. I mean, you could devise an argument for why you should, but it seems completely unnatural. But that is not the text that people tend to look upon when considering the question of women in the Minyan. The text that we get all involved with is this one, the second text of the evening, and this is from Mishnah Kiddushin. It says, "V'kol mitzvot aseh shehazman gorma, anashim chayavim v'nashim pitorot." For all mitzvot that are time bound, men are obligated and women are exempt. Now, the requirement to pray, as we understand it from the Torah, falls equally on men and women. But the requirement to participate in time-bound prayer services, the requirement to go to the synagogue at certain times and pray, is understood to only apply to men because of this rule. And because of this rule, there's the question of, well, if women aren't obligated, can they count in the Minyan? The rationale for this distinction, I mean, and mostly is the realm in apologetics. Some of them are just horrible, and some of them are not so horrible. One rationale for it is that, well, women don't have to come to time-bound services because women are naturally at a higher spiritual level. We hear people say this in a lot of circumstances. Well, when we exclude women from religious practices, it's only because we respect them so much, that their souls are so pristine and pure, that they don't have the terrible and the terrible and corrupt souls of men who need to go to these prayers. I mean, that's insulting from the point of view that it's not really true in terms of the motivation, but it's also insulting towards men. I mean, you're basically saying that men are these corrupt and terrible things. There's the feeling, this one is from the Rebbe, that women perform the mitzvot through their husband, that when I am participating in time-bound prayer, Debbie is participating through me. Our general concern that men and women praying together can lead to mixed dancing, that there's going to be sort of tensions and sexuality at play. I mean, that's true. I don't think that's I don't think we need to pretend that that's not an issue of concentration, that the sexual drive and sexual thoughts are very powerful, and that's potentially a cost of having an egalitarian minyan, but also that women are immersed in family duties and can't be required in time-bound tasks is another rationale. But we don't, again, this is a rationale that we don't apply it consistently. I remember when I was in rabbinical school, I took 6 or 8 months off to take care of Becky while Debbie went to work. And so the question arises, well, if the rationale is that if you're immersed in family duties and can't be required in time-bound tasks, does that mean that I was patur from Minyan, that I was exempt from Minyan, or that I shouldn't count in the Minyan? I actually asked a rabbi that, and he said, well, that's a good argument, but we don't rule according to that argument. We don't consider that we don't consider that a valid halakhic stance. But these are the concerns and the rationales that have been put forward to understand the rabbinic exemption of women from prayer. The way that we have worked around this in the conservative movement, there was one bold shot that that really didn't take root, and then there was one sort of global fix that we do. The first attempt to get around this was by a response, a rabbi named Joel Roth, who basically said, well, we accept the rabbi's distinction, but we also accept that women can declare themselves to be obligated in these mitzvot. So if women want to be rabbis, if women want to go to rabbinical school, if women want to participate in Minyan, we have some sort of interrogation where we ask the woman, are you going to volunteer to be obligated in these things? And if they say yes, then we let them in. That turned out to be problematic. And so the chancellor at the seminary just said that our understanding going forward is going to be that men and women are equally obligated, that the position of the Talmud, the position of the rabbis is dictated by sociology that does not apply. And we're just going to assume that everyone is obligated in tefillah and work under that assumption. And that's probably the state of play in the moment in the conservative movement. And I finished exactly at 9 o'clock. I wasn't looking at the clock. That's it's 9 o'clock. That was, but I will stay on, and I'm anxious to hear your comments, your questions. What was new? What was not new? What do you want to know more about? Or what was helpful? What you need? What else do you need to navigate this question of minyans? Next week we're talking about mourner's Kaddish, which I think is also a pretty essential institution of the synagogue to try to wrap our heads around.
Rabbi, you said something about adding, using the Torah for the 10th person. You said you discuss it afterwards.
Oh, so who here has seen this happen?
We have.
Everyone's, so this
We
is,
did it with reluctance a few times, but the policy has been that we're not doing it because some people were very insulted by it. Some of the women were insulted by it. So why do it at all?
But we used, years ago, they did it.
Yes.
I know, but we decided to stop doing it because some people objected to it, and they had a right to object to it. The best thing is to get a minyan.
I think this is a widespread, in Philadelphia, if there's 9 people, and this was an egalitarian minyan, if there were 9 people in the chapel and it came time for the Baruch Hu, that ark door was open and up. And so there is, the Talmud knows about this this custom. It's related to the custom of counting a minor as the 10th, because it's usually depicted as the minor is going to be holding the Sefer Torah. You take the Sefer Torah out and you put it in the lap of the minor, and
yeah, we've done that. Yeah,
and because he's holding it in a particular way, you know that he counts. So that's related to it. But even though the Talmud specifically approves of the custom of counting the minor as the 10th, the Talmud explicitly says you should not count the Aron, the ark, as the 10th, and that's the basis of would be the basis of my objection to doing it. I mean, with the so I mean it isn't. I mean, you could have a situation where you had 8 adults, a minor, and the Torah scroll, and it gets complicated. So in most of the synagogues I've worked in, we've counted the minor but not the Sefer Torah scroll. But in Philadelphia, where I grew up, I tell you, if Kaddish rolls around and there's 9 people there, that Torah is coming out.
Rabbi, define minor. I mean, are we talking a baby or are we talking a 10-year-old?
13 or not by mitzvah.
I would,
right, but how? I mean,
for purposes of what I would do, there's not a clear line, but a little. I'm not going to count like a little kid who's like playing with cars in the back of the synagogue. A kid though that can sit and who's watching the service and is listening, I think that would be suitable for the requirement. It's not so much in age. I mean, a 5-year-old kid, if he wanted to sit with the chumash in his lap and is listening, we could say, well, this is a person who knows a little bit about what's going on, and we could count them. I guess on the other hand, if it was like an 11-year-old who was riding a three-wheeler around the synagogue, you would say no until he agrees to put the three-wheeler up and sit quietly and participate.
We used to, I remember if they were sort of bar mitzvah age and they would sit and hold the Torah, that we could count them, but I prefer to get a minyan.
That's really the best answer to the controversies, in my opinion. If you,
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, I feel strongly about egalitarianism just in itself. I mean, I wouldn't take the position, well, we need to have 12. I'd like there always to be 10 men in the synagogue because that means there's going to be a lot of people there. I'm a little. Sometimes people say that we had 16 people, but only 7 of them were men. And they say it as though that's a problem. I mean, I take the egalitarian part of it more seriously than that. But I mean, the general answer to your minyan problems is to have like a bunch of people there, so you don't have to worry.
That's right. You just hit the rabbi, just hit the note that's important. As long as there's a bunch of people, and it looks like a minyan, it is a minyan, and you don't have to embarrass anybody. You don't walk around asking people, are you Jewish? Are you not Jewish? That's the worst thing to do, is to embarrass somebody.
It really is, and it's awkward. It's awkward.
Yeah.
Rabbi, I would think we should just touch on virtual minyanim since we've been in the midst of them for quite a while. I assume that the basis for what we're doing perhaps is on thin ice, which is getting thinner. At what point does it not feel right to do prayers that require a minyan on Zoom?
So I would just say that what we've done here has not really been the basis of halakhic reasoning or arguments. Some people have made those. My philosophy has been that it's an emergency situation. And when it's an emergency situation, you do what you have to do. The difficulty is that, again, the line isn't clear. There are probably some of us that feel that it's no longer a state of emergency and that we're doing something that's safer, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily meet the standard of, well, we throw the halakha book out the window. And there are some people who might feel otherwise, that the state of, that the situation is such that it is a state of emergency. That's not, I mean, I don't think it's the case that there isn't an answer to that. It's not a conversation that we've had. And I think that we're just hoping to move back into our previous world before that tension becomes more palpable. But it's, I think that's, I mean, the question is, do you believe that it's a state of an emergency? Do you believe that we are in a state of an emergency that requires us to take an extraordinary measure? And I think that people would come down on either side of that at this point. It is so wonderful to have more than a minyan here for adult education. You guys are great. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is recorded. If you want to review it, it'll be on the website. And as I said, next week we're going to talk about the mourner's Kaddish. We're going to talk about what the words mean. We're going to talk about when people say it, and we're going to talk about a little bit of the history of how it's been handed down to us. I think that for I mean, there's no one prayer that we do that's more important than any other prayer. But I think that it is the truth that for a lot of people, for a lot of us, that the mourner's Kaddish is one of the more emotional moments that when we come together as Jews. And I hope we have the opportunity to learn a little bit about this next week. And until then, I will see you virtually in synagogue.
Rabbi, can I just say one quick thing? First, very, very good class. In the announcements email, it stated I was going to teach on Monday, this coming Monday, but as I shared with the people that joined the class last week, we will skip this Monday. So just a correction from the announcement. No Parsha class this Monday, but we'll resume the week after.
That was my fault, David. I sent the wrong information to Brian, and I apologize to you. And we will correct the record. Thanks for reminding us.
So, Rabbi, when I was coming to this, I was in my car about 5 or 8, and they announced that there's been a halt in the war in the Middle East. Did anybody else hear that besides me?
Ceasefire tomorrow.
No, it started
We
tonight.
all heard it. We all heard it. Was
We
on
all
the
heard.
news.
Okay, good. Okay.
What did he say? Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
Rabbi.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to
Good night,
see you.
good night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to have you back.
It's great to be back.
Uh-huh.
Nechama,
Yes.
nice to
uh-huh.
see you.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to see you all. Thank you. And thanks to the